Thanks so much, Mark. I've spoken at Action for Happiness events before, and I really like them because I think there is something about the atmosphere that is created here that is just so nice, and I could already see everyone chatting to everybody, and there is just something very, very friendly about it, I think. So I was very pleased to be invited here again. So what I'm going to talk about is rest and the science of rest in a way. And when I talk about rest, I'm not talking about sleep. I'm talking about the things we might do when we're awake but relaxing. So it could be any sort of different activity, but it's something that's chosen, that you've decided you want to do, that's voluntary, something that gives you a break from what else is going on, and something that leaves you feeling more relaxed afterwards. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how we can go about taking rest more seriously, because people have started to take sleep much more seriously, I think. And we see lots of research about sleep and why it's so vital for our well-being as well as our health. And we haven't seen quite as much about rest, about the waking rest and why that's important. But I've been looking at all the evidence that is out there on it, and it really is something that's important for all of us. It's not something that's lazy, and I think often it's seen as something that's lazy and we think we mustn't do it, but I'm going to talk about why we should do it. So I'd be interested to know, out of the people here, how many of you, just a show of hands, how many people would like it if they could get more rest? Quite a lot of you, if not, yes, the vast majority of you. And I wonder if you can think for a moment of what it is that might be stopping you from getting more rest. What are those barriers? What is it that means that you can't get this sort of rest that you like? And I wonder if you could turn again perhaps to the people near you, the people you were talking to before, and do include anyone else if pairs don't work exactly. Just to quickly tell the other person what it is that stops you getting rest, the rest that you might like to get. And we'll just spend a minute or so doing that. Okay, let's come back together. So I'm gathering from the noise in the room, there's probably quite a lot of things that are stopping you resting. I wonder if just a couple of people could share with us what things they said were stopping them resting. Who'd like to tell us? Yes. Coming here, stopping you resting. But it might be restful. It might be a restful experience. Coming and being with other people is a very good one. Yeah. Time, yeah. Time is often a big one. Yeah, very, very, very key one there, guilt as well. And both time and guilt are something I will talk about much more. And so what we do know is that relaxing is good for us, but how often do we get time to do that? And how often do we feel that we can do that without feeling guilty? And so I think this isn't a charter for laziness. We need to start, taking rest seriously. But one of the difficulties that there are a lot of standards that we partly set for ourselves these days of the things people feel they ought to be doing instead, that they ought to be, as well as working and caring for others, that also they need to be perhaps improving themselves, learning new things, perhaps that you feel you need to be getting fit because obviously that's good for you, or looking a certain way, or that when people come around to eat you must make them the most amazing dinner that's ever been seen. So there are all these different standards that we try to keep up with now. And many of us feel overwhelmed by the amount of things that there are on our to-do lists. And yet, if you look at time use surveys where they've had people keep minute by minute and hour by hour records of their activities as they go along, and these surveys go back a long time. If you look at these surveys from the 1950s, it's not the case that people had loads more free time in the 1950s than they have now. In fact, on average, we have slightly more free time than people had in the 1950s. And yet, many people will say it doesn't feel like that. Many people will say they just feel constantly busy, constantly too busy, and that they have too much to do. And I think there are various reasons for this, and I think that modern life does feel like that. One of the reasons is that new technology, which can be amazing in many ways, and I'm not someone who thinks that new technology is at the root of all problems in society. But it does mean that the boundaries between work and non-work time, leisure time, have become more blurred than they used to be. And so even if your boss doesn't email you at 10:30 at night to ask you about something, you know that they could. And that in itself can feel unrestful, just knowing that they could do that. Also, I think there are things that we do in our leisure time that now feel a little bit more like work than they used to. So even something fun, like if you imagine you're going out with, you want to get together and go out with a group of friends. So first of all, you've got to message those friends in some way, to email them or WhatsApp them or whatever. Message those friends, do a doodle poll, find the date that everyone can do. When you finally get to there, maybe you need to decide to go to something. Maybe you're going to book to go somewhere in particular or to arrange at a certain place. That then might take some research or to do that, and then you might need to book that place, which tends to mean you fill in a form online. And these are the sorts of things that, in a way, companies have outsourced some of their admin to us. And so now we end up filling in the form online when you used to, once upon a time, you would have phoned up to do that. But it means that something that should be fun in a way, is a leisure activity, also feels a bit more like work. And so more and more things can feel like work, which can make us feel more and more overwhelmed. So we know that resting and relaxation is good for us. It is good for us mentally. There is good evidence that it's good for people. It's good for our mental health. It's good for us physically. It's also good for us cognitively. And so it can even boost our memories and concentration if we take a break. And the opposite, of course, fatigue, we know leads to memory lapses, to blunted emotions, to mistakes, which can be, very serious mistakes, like, say, accidents when you're driving, and to misunderstandings and arguments and poorer judgments. So there are quite a lot of reasons for trying not to be fatigued if you possibly can. So we do need to give ourselves a break. Now, I saw this on a chair in Hong Kong in a gallery. And now I'm not saying you have to go that far, because there are some marvelous things about work. You don't have to go that far. But what we do need to do is to have breaks more often. And so, the hour-long lunch hour is something that is becoming rarer. I mean, it almost needs to, in many places, it needs to be your birthday now to have an excuse to take an hour's lunch break, when in theory, most places, you're not paid for your lunch break. But it isn't now available to that many people to take a whole hour for lunch. But even micro breaks can make a difference. So there's been some really interesting research from South Korea looking at 2-minute micro breaks. And they got people to have take these breaks. These are people working in offices. And then they looked to see what happened to them, how well they were paying attention later, and what their well-being was like at the end of the day. And during these micro breaks, sometimes people would just lean back in their chair and shut their eyes, or go and stare out of the window, or go and get a drink but bring it back to their desk, because these were very short breaks, or just chat to somebody. Or some people would go online shopping or look at their personal emails and things like that in the 2-minute breaks. But what they found was the people who had these micro breaks were concentrating better an hour later than if they hadn't had the 2-minute break. So it's not the case that if we had a 2-minute break, we would then get less work done and be more productive. In fact, we would be concentrating better an hour later. And at the end of the day, people's well-being levels were higher if they'd had a series of these breaks. But the breaks were much more effective if people didn't do something else that felt a bit like work, like online shopping or anything going online, or looking at their emails, even personal emails. The things that were really effective were the things like closing their eyes, or going to get a drink, wandering about, or looking out of the window. Basically, all the things you were told not to do at school, like staring out of the window and doodling and daydreaming, they're all excellent, and I give you permission to do all of those. And if your boss complains if you have your eyes shut on the chair, you can say this is evidence-based, and so there is evidence I'm allowed to do this. But there's also some interesting evidence from Germany which shows that people tend to benefit most from a break when they're working hardest, when they're up against a deadline. But this is also the time we tend not to allow ourselves to have the break, of course, because we know we're in a rush. And people will often decide that what they will do is reward themselves with the break, maybe they're going to get a cup of tea, when they've finished the task rather than during the task. And in fact, it would be much more effective to do it while you're still trying to get this thing finished, to go and have your very quick break then and come back, because you will be able to work faster and concentrate better and do your task better when you come back. So one thing we shouldn't do is to delay those breaks that we might be having. Now, making a cup of tea is excellent. Because it only takes a short time and you can come back to your desk. It is something where you can do it for other people too, which is lovely if you to make all of those. I made all of those. I did give them to other people as well as using them for a photograph. It's that perfect break where you might get a little bit of socializing, you get a little bit of break from what you were thinking about and what you were doing. And as I say, after that, your concentration levels are better. But breaks, whether with tea or not, also help our memories too. And so they've done some really interesting studies in Scotland. A researcher called Michaela Dewar at Strathclyde University has done studies where she gets people to go into a room and then and learn a whole list of words, and then either they can sit in the room and have the lights down for 10 minutes, or they're assigned to do another task, something completely different, not to do with the words, for 10 minutes instead. And the people who have the break remember significantly more of the words from the long word list than the people who don't. And what's really remarkable is that this even works for people with amnesia. So obviously if people have amnesia, not surprisingly, they find it very hard to learn new lists of words, because usually they can't make new memories. So people tend to get 14% of the words right. That's as many as they can remember if they have amnesia on average. But she found with a 10-minute break, the people with amnesia could suddenly get 49% of the words right instead, which is a really remarkable improvement. And the kind of improvement other interventions would work really hard to get that kind of improvement. And so it shows how we really shouldn't underestimate what stopping can do for us and what that can do for our brains and how much that can help us. And she also found it helped with tests of insight as well. So insight is when there's a problem or a puzzle and you either know the answer, or which is when you have the insight into the answer, or you don't know the answer. There's sort of no in between. You can't half know it. You either know it or you don't. And then there's that moment of insight. And she tested people on those as well. So there are tests like this. This is a well-known phrase or saying, and each word begins with those letters. Can anyone see what that is? Has anyone got insight immediately? Yeah. Yes, all's well that ends well. And this one? Yes. So those are tests of insight, and they will give people long lists of those to do. Some are much harder than others, and you can kind of either see it or you can't. And again, she found in this research that if people had a break, they were much better at doing those than if they hadn't just had a break. So there are a couple of difficulties with trying to rest. You mentioned guilt was mentioned over here, and I suspect some other people may have mentioned guilt as well. In the research that I was part of, which I will talk about it more in a bit, 9% of people told us they felt guilty whenever they rested. So they sort of felt they almost shouldn't be allowed to do this, that they didn't deserve this somehow and shouldn't be allowed to rest. And I think there is an extent to which busyness has become something of a badge of honor. If you look now, say, on something like Instagram, the sort of, richest, most successful celebrities, their pictures of themselves that they post don't tend to be pictures of them just lying on a beach. They might sometimes, but often they're doing stuff, and they're showing you what they're doing all the time. And if you contrast that with, say, 19th century, 18th century gentlemen of leisure, and they were usually gentlemen, those ones who had lots of money, would show off they had that money and that status by going out to the country or, being around town with their friends and being out and about, and basically not showing off about how much they did, but about how much leisure time they had. And yet now that seems to have really changed, and busyness is something people want to be seen as busy. And, people will say to me, oh, how are you? How's work? How's it all going? And I'll say, oh, I'm really busy. A bit too busy, but, that's okay. I'm really busy. And in a way that feels true. But on the other hand, how much is that a claim to status and to sort of say, oh, I must be important and valued because look how busy I am. So I must be important. And I think the problem is that we do think that busy people are better, but it isn't always something useful we're doing. So Henry David Thoreau, the writer, said, it's not enough to be busy, so are the ants. What are we busy about? So there is a question of how much our busyness is really achieving for us or for other people. Now, the problem is we do think that other busy people are better. So there's a researcher, an Italian researcher called Silvia Bellessa. And Silvia did research asking people what they thought about a fictional character called Sally Fisher. And what she did was give them Facebook posts and there was a busy version of Sally Fisher. So it's Wednesday at 1:30, she's just got a quick 10 minutes for lunch. It's Friday at 5, still working. And then there was a less busy version of Sally. So she says on Wednesday, having a long lunch, and on Friday at 5, done with work. And then they asked people, so half the people got one busy Sally, and half the people got not busy Sally. And then they asked them what they thought of her. Interestingly, they didn't comment that her Facebook posts are a little bit dull, to be honest. And that there is a sort of rule of thumb, if don't say anything at all if it's not worth posting. But, hey, never mind. What people did say was that they thought that busy Sally was more organised, better at multitasking, more efficient, and had a more meaningful job. And they read all of that into whether she had an hour for lunch or not and how soon she finished work on a Friday. And so the problem is that one of the reasons it's hard to rest ourselves is that we do think that people are better if they're busier, when that is, not necessarily the case. And there are cultural differences as well. So the same researcher did a study where she looked at people in the US and people in Italy, and she gave the people in Italy a character called Giovanni and the people in the US a character called Jeff. And then explained to them either that Jeff or Giovanni worked ever such a lot, or that Jeff or Giovanni didn't work ever such a lot, and then asked what they thought of him. And the Americans, on average, tended to say that they thought that the busy version of Jeff must be very rich and successful because he was so busy and working all the time. On average, the Italians said that they thought that the less busy version of Giovanni must be rich because he was so rich he wasn't having to work all hours. Now, I think they may be onto something good there, and that maybe we might want to go, slightly more that way. So sometimes it's us deciding that we need to be busy in order to have status. But time was the other thing that is mentioned. And it is also true that sometimes we just don't have enough time. There are just too many other things that have to be done, particularly, say, if people are caring for small kids and working as well, and maybe caring for older parents or others who need it as well, and trying to combine all that with work and everything else they're trying to do, then there are very few moments to rest, and that can be really difficult. It's also the case that sometimes we take on too many things, partly because we're sweetly optimistic about how much we can get done. And so there is a concept you may have heard of called the planning fallacy. And this is where we think we can do something much more quickly than we really can in reality. So we might think that in a weekend we can rip out our old kitchen and replace a new one all by ourselves. And we think, I'll get up early, I'll get that done. And, 2 months later, you still haven't got a sink that works. So, and of course it happens with huge infrastructure projects as well. And so we know these things happen all the time, that people underestimate how long things will take. My favourite example of the planning fallacy actually is the Oxford English Dictionary. And so it was first mooted as an idea in 1857. They got started 5 years later in 1862, and they thought it would take about 5 years to get this dictionary done for the first time with every word in the English language and its definitions. After 5 years, they'd got to the word ant. So they were quite early on in that there. And then, in fact, they finished it in 1928, so it was more than 70 years late, and then it was out of date, and they had to start again, which was a bit of a shame. So that's quite an extreme version of the planning fallacy. And that can be one of the things that means we don't have enough time to do things we want to do or to rest. So one thing you can do to try to avoid that is to, if someone asks you to do something and you're not sure whether you can do it or not, is to, and particularly if it's in the future, like if it's in 6 months' time, and maybe you live here and somebody wants you to go to Scotland and do something, and you say, oh yeah, that'll be fine because I'll have loads of time in the future. Because sweetly, we think that we'll be more organised versions of ourselves in the future and have more time. I don't want to disappoint you, but you're probably not going to be a more organised version of yourself in the future unless you take some real steps to do that. So we might just need to accept that, and that is fine. And so what you can decide to do is, instead of thinking this thing is in 6 months' time, imagine what would your answer be if it was the week after next or next week. Would you think, oh my goodness, there's absolutely no way I can do that, I've got far too much to do, or would you think, yes, I can fit that in? So it might be a question of trying to work out some things to say yes to, and some things to say no to, and maybe to work out who it is who would benefit most from your help if you're using your spare time to help somebody else. And then you might be able to rest a bit more. Now, this my interest in rest came about through a residency I was asked to be part of at the Welcome Collection up on the Euston Road, opposite Euston Station, where a group of 5 of us applied for a grant to study rest in lots of different ways with a big interdisciplinary group. We have musicians and composers and poets and neuroscientists and historians and geographers and all sorts of people that when we won the grant, to our surprise, that we invited along. And lots of people said to us, oh, this will be really easy, studying rest for 2 years. You can just all laze about. And we didn't. We did acquire a hammock. We got a hammock, and that was very popular with visitors, we found, who always got straight into the hammock. We were always really busy and didn't get much time to be in the hammock ever, really. We did all sorts of things, like exhibitions and all sorts. But one of the things that I wanted to explore was, I wondered, what do lots and lots of people think about rest? Because it's not a subject where there has been lots of research. There's been research on physiological relaxation and things like that, but not that much research, especially compared with sleep, on the impact of rest on people, or of what people think rest is and what people find restful. So a group of psychologists at Durham University, who are part of this residency, devised a big online survey called the Rest Test. And we launched this on All in the Mind, the programme I present on Radio 4 that's about mental health and well-being and psychology. And we launched it on that and on Health Check, which is a programme about global health that I present on the World Service. And then we waited to see, would people be interested in filling this in or not? And we had no idea whether they would. Anyway, they were. 18,000 people from 135 different countries filled it in. And so it's now the biggest study that's been done on this topic. And we looked to see, what did people think about rest. Now, of course, there was the issue that maybe, because people are deciding whether to take part or not, so which means you can't be sure you've got a representative sample, because we can't make anyone take part online. The scientists amongst you may be thinking, well, maybe all the people who want more rest were the ones who filled it in. But the survey took about 40 minutes to fill in, so we're hoping that the laziest people of all will have self-selected themselves out and not taken part, leaving everyone else there. So what we found was that 2/3 of people said that they would like more rest, which is interesting because that's, I think, slightly more than 2/3 of people said that here. But 2/3 of people said that they would like more rest. We found that we also looked at well-being, and we found that the people with and we asked people how much rest they'd had the day before, and we found that the people with the highest levels of well-being had had between 5 and 6 hours rest on average the previous day. Now that sounds like ever such a lot, but it depends what you define as rest. And so if you like your train journey, then that can be restful. If you enjoy, say, cooking the dinner, then that could count as restful as well. If you add up all of those bits, then you can come to more than you think. Although the average people had was 3 hours rest the previous day. So we found that people's well-being was higher if they'd had 5 hours rest. But then if people had much more than that, say people had 10 hours rest, 11 hours rest, their levels of well-being went down again. So there seemed to be an optimum kind of midpoint of getting enough rest. And I think that's really crucial, because I'm not saying that what we must all do is absolutely rest as much as possible. And I think that it may have been when people had really long periods of rest, this may have reflected that perhaps they were ill and only able to rest and not able to do the things they might like to do, or perhaps they were unemployed and didn't want to be and didn't feel that they had enough things that they wanted to do. And so I think what we need to get right is the balance of the rhythms of rest and activity. It's not just about resting all the time. It's about getting these rhythms, and so that you can contrast the activity with the rest. We found that men were more likely than women to say that they thought they got less rest than average. In fact, on average, the men got 10 minutes more rest a day than women. But only 10 minutes, which is not that bad. Now, we also asked people, a major part of it was asking people what activities they considered restful. Having a nap doesn't count. Sleeping doesn't count. So we're talking about wakeful rest here. And I wonder if you can think for a moment what activities you find the most restful. It can be anything at all. I wonder if you'd like to chat for a moment with your neighbour about what it is, what's the activity, or maybe a couple of activities that you find most restful of all. And we'll see if you found the same as they did. Okay, let's come back together. I'm really interested to know what sorts of activities people are saying. Would people like to call out a few of the activities they've mentioned? What sort of things do we have over here? Tap dancing. Well, that's good. What other things are restful? Cooking. Listening to music. Meditation, reading. Walking the dog. Reflexology. Talking. Cycling. So there's a real range of things there, and so what I've then done is to look at the top 10, and in my book I count down backwards, Sunday chart style, or Fridays as it is now, the top 10 down to number 1 of the activities that the most people of these 18,000 people said that they found restful. And the first thing that really struck me when I saw the list was some of the things that don't appear. Tap dancing didn't appear, but that might be too specific, but exercise did. In the top 10, we didn't have gardening, which is my favourite, which I think is so relaxing. It was in the top 15, but not in the top 10. Eating wasn't in the top 10. That was at number 21. Nor socialising, which was at number 20. Spending time with pets didn't make it into the top 10, but did make it into the top 15. That's my friend's kittens. For the dog lovers, my sister's puppy. She's sweet. Sex was down at number 22. Now you're wondering what picture I'm going to have for that now, aren't you? There we are. I thought that was a nice picture. And then I thought, what are those two doing on the left? But, I don't know what they're doing down there. But anyway, it's a lovely, restful picture. And I just took it. I saw it in a tank and took that and thought it was rather beautiful. So there were some differences with age that we found. So the younger people put daydreaming and hot baths and sex as more restful than the older people did. I don't know if that means they're doing it right or wrong, but But remember, we asked people about what's restful, not what's most enjoyable. So with things like socializing, somebody said chatting down here. So those came in the top 20 and top 25, but not in the top 10. And we were really struck by that because loads of people would say that they enjoy those things. Seeing friends and family didn't come in the top 10. Even when you separated friends and family. And this was even when we also used a personality scale, so we could look at people's personalities as well. And in theory, the people who score high on extroversion, they should be energized by seeing other people. And so we wondered what if we just take the extroverts, do they then put socializing much higher? And they didn't. They put it a tiny bit higher, but it still didn't appear in the top 10. And in fact, the top 5 activities are all activities that people tend to do on their own, suggesting that partly what people want to do in order to rest rather than to enjoy themselves the most is to have a bit of a rest from other people. And in fact, at number 3 was spending time on your own, being alone. And I thought that was really striking, that the nice thing about being on your own when you choose to be on your own is that nobody sort of expects anything from you. You don't have to attend to what somebody else might be needing or might be thinking about you or any of those things. People really can just, relax and be themselves. And maybe that then helps people come back to be able to, feel refreshed and do the things they want to do. So I won't count down all the top 10 activities here, but let me finish by telling you, before we open for questions, which was the top activity, the number one most restful activity voted for by 18,000 people, which I think a couple of people did say here, was reading, which is always good if you've just written a book, I find. But but what I think it's really interesting that reading came top, because reading is something that is cognitively effortful. You have to look at the words and work out what they mean and relate them to what was going before. And at first we sort of thought, so were people just saying reading to try and look good? But in fact, many thousands of people were prepared to say that they liked doing nothing in particular. And so I think we can trust that people were trying to be honest about what they said they liked. And one of the things about reading, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, is that, of course, it takes you out of your world and into someone else's world. And so I think the activities that are really restful, which will be different for different people, are the things that they distract you and from the thoughts that are whirring around in your head. They distract you from those. There's something where you can give yourself permission to rest. So most people don't feel too guilty about reading, so that helps because we know reading's good for us. The thing that lets you feel you've got a break from what's going on in your own life. And reading can provide all of those things. It can also be a jumping off point for daydreaming. So I'm sure you've all had that experience where you read a whole page and you get to the bottom and you haven't taken any of that at all. And so you go back and read it again and probably still don't concentrate the next time either, and then you read it again or give up. But what's interesting is in studies, they can tell whether people are concentrating when they read or not. And when they don't concentrate, in psychology it's called mindless reading, which sounds slightly judgmental because we know now daydreaming is okay. And so they can track people's eyes. And normally, if you're concentrating, your eyes slow down a bit when you get to a difficult or unusual word. But if people are doing mindless reading, their eyes carry on going across and down, across and down, across and down, but they don't slow down for the difficult words. And so that's how they can tell that a proportion of the time, most people are daydreaming when they are reading. And that maybe another reason why reading is restful is that it almost provides a kind of jumping off point for daydreaming. And allows us to get to that state. So what I'm talking about is sort of not some made-up self-help, if you like. Everything I talk about is based on evidence and the best research that's been done in the world on these things. And I think if you want to rest more, what you need to do is to work out, in a way, your own perfect prescription for rest. It's not the case that if everyone does, say, reading and then going for a walk and being in nature, that will be the right prescription for rest for you. It can be things that are in the top 10. It can be things that are not. But I think it's a question of finding the thing for you that is really... there's a further one. Isn't that nice? I'll leave that there for a moment just because it's nice. That are really relaxing for you. The thing where... So for me, it is gardening. And now... When I'm working at home, in the middle of the afternoon, I prescribe myself, for the sake of my own mental health, 15 minutes of gardening. And I now don't feel guilty about doing this. I think this is good for my mental health, and I'm going to do this. And for me, within minutes of just going outside, I've got this little garden, going outside, deadheading a few things, I feel a sort of wave of calm come over me. Now, I know, surprisingly, some people hate gardening, so it won't be gardening for everybody. But if you can find the thing that is really... that really for you distracts you particularly from the thoughts that might worry you, then that can be really powerful. And then give yourself permission to do that thing. And it may mean trying to spot, if you're really busy, and particularly, I know it's particularly difficult if people are caring for other people, is to snatch those moments of, particularly any moments of unexpected rest, to find any little moments and to recognize those moments and to think, yeah, I'm getting some rest now. I could go and, quickly put on some more washing or whatever, but no, what I'm going to do is I am just going to make a cup of tea and sit for a moment, or whatever it is that you find is restful. That may make you feel restless, so it needs to be the thing that you did. But do all the things that you weren't allowed to do at school. And so... doodle and stare out of the window and do all of those things. And whether you've been listening now intently or whether your mind has drifted off a bit, which is okay, that's all fine because you've been resting while you're here, and that is something that is worth us striving for. Thank you.
Claudia, thank you so much. Folks, plenty more still to come, including, I'd love to hear some of your questions and observations, but a few things came up for me which I'd love to ask, and I hope are of interest for all of you. The first is, you've made a really strong case that rest is good for us individually, but there seems there's a couple of problems with that. One is, I think, that we've heard people feel guilty about taking that opportunity. But there's also this sense, I don't know if you get this too, folks, that the sort of wellness industry is trying to sell us rest-type products. There's a sense of sort of slightly narcissistic, go and pamper yourself in the bath, and it sort of almost doesn't fit comfortably. And yet, I'm very struck by a theme we see a lot in our community, which is around self-care isn't selfish. Actually, you can't pour from an empty cup. This whole idea that actually, when we're rested, we're better able to be a good parent, a good friend, and so on. What did you find with that sense of rest being not only good for us, but good for those around us, that sort of compassionate...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely the case that it is. And if you're completely exhausted and fatigued yourself, then caring for, and being compassionate towards other people is very difficult. And in fact, we know that the more fatigued people are, the more likely there are to be, misunderstandings, the more likely they are to, jump to the wrong conclusions about what someone else meant when they said something, and the harder it is, in a way, to be kind to other people. So I think... in order to be kind to other people, then it is, a good idea to get rest yourself. I mean, I think you make a really good point about, commercialism and the wellness industry, if you like. And I think that resting doesn't have to mean buying a hugely expensive bath bomb. You don't have to do that. And so I think often it can be associated with products and associated with kind of, you deserve it, but you must buy this in order to pamper yourself. But I think if you find the things that are most restful for you, they don't necessarily cost lots of money, and hopefully you can find ones that don't cost lots of money. And in fact, these things on this list, having a bath did appear on the list, but it wasn't mentioned that it was a bath with lots of expensive things. So and going for a walk is free, and many of these things are free or can be. Books from the library. These things, many of these things can be free. Listening to music was another one that was in the top 5.
So recognising it's good for us, recognising it doesn't have to cost anything, recognising it can help others, but this guilt thing still seems to be there, though. So why do we find it hard to make time? Now, I find my own self conflicted around if I'm choosing to go and cycle, a restful activity I really like, then that's at the expense of being with loved ones. What's the right trade-off here? How do we get out of our own way of making space for it?
Yeah, I think that's really difficult. And I think that giving yourself permission to rest is one of the hardest things there is. And I think it's slightly easier to give yourself permission to rest if you know it's something good for you, like exercise. And I think that might be one of the reasons why exercise is a popular way of resting for some people, is that it's the one thing that enables them to feel less guilty while they do it. But there is still the thing, of course, that you're then leaving other people, to perhaps do the work during that time. And so then I think it's a question of working out the balance of, well, is this then helping you to care for others better and be a nicer person while you're doing that? In which case it is okay to look after yourself as well, because basically, burnout is a thing that happens in all sorts of, particularly in jobs and in caring professions. If people don't feel that they can give themselves permission to look after themselves, then they're more likely to get burnt out, and then they can't help others.
I like that phrase, permission, because I think that's what it's all about. But is this also relevant then for us, I know this community is particularly interested in not just our own well-being, but the well-being of those around us. I mean, can we do more to give permission to others in our team at work, in our families, can we make it more acceptable collectively for people to rest?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good thing to do, and I think that one of the things I've been trying to do is sort of open up a conversation about rest where it's not lazy to say that you want to rest, and so also then that should be possible to give other people around you permission to do that as well, and to perhaps notice if a colleague doesn't seem to be getting, any rest, and to perhaps encourage other people to have those micro breaks, as well as trying to take them yourself, to think, well, let's go and make a quick cup of tea together, and to notice what's going on around you for other people, and that maybe they're not getting enough of that, and because, there's often... people will often say you don't know what's going on for other people, so we need to be patient and tolerant if somebody, seems to be behaving in a way that we don't really like. Or maybe one of the things is that they're not getting enough rest, and maybe there are ways of encouraging that without them feeling guilty. But I think it is really difficult, because people will still there is this still big association with laziness with it, and so we know that some people are. When it comes to sleep, some people are larks and some people are owls, and I'm very much an owl. I really hate early morning starts, and if somebody wants to have a meeting with me, the phrase breakfast meeting chills the bone. I don't care if you get free breakfast. It's that's when I'm asleep. But even then, I still can't admit to people. I'll pretend I'm busy and suggest another time, rather than saying, well, I'll be asleep. I'll be in bed at that time. So, I'm not meeting you at 7:30. I'm not doing it. Whereas I would happily meet. I don't mind meeting in the evening. This is great. Evening's great. I'm awake now. So even then, I think it's difficult. I think there is so much of a strong cultural thing about what's lazy and what's not, and none of us want to look lazy.
Well, that's why your book's timely, I think. In a moment, I'm just going to turn for audience questions. One final thing. Talk to us about loneliness, because, of course, we know that there's this big cultural challenge around people feeling more disconnected, more isolated. And yet, what seems to come out strongly is that a sense of solitude or being by yourself is really good. What's the difference between sort of solitude and loneliness?
Yeah, it's really interesting, this, and I think it is all about whether you choose it or not. So loneliness is defined within psychology as not having the connections and relationships that you would like to have. Whereas solitude is almost, if you can seek solitude, if you do have those relationships that you would like to have. And something that one person I interviewed was saying that she always asks her students is, who are you with when you're alone? And there is a sense that if you don't feel lonely and you do have the relationships you want, then when you're alone, you're almost sort of with those other people as well, because you just know that general warm idea of them being around you and that you have those relationships. If you don't have that, then we know that the pain of loneliness can be very, very strong indeed. And after we did the rest test, we then, the next big survey like this that I did was called the BBC Loneliness Experiment. And 55,000 people took part in that one, showing what a pressing issue that is. And there we found that the people who were younger were more of those were more likely to say that they felt lonely, although we saw loneliness in all age groups. And one of the things we asked people was, what's the opposite of loneliness? And people said all sorts of things like connectedness or friendship or companionship and things like that. And then after we'd done this, somebody I know I live in a very sociable street, very lucky, and somebody I know who lives in my street stopped me and he said, I've been thinking about your question that I heard on the radio about what's the opposite of loneliness. loneliness. And he said, I think the opposite of loneliness is wanting to be alone, which in a way comes back round to the rest and the wanting to be alone. And I think he's right. In a way, that is the opposite. If you don't feel lonely, then you can want to be alone. But I think there does seem to be something very powerful rest-wise about having happy time alone.
Thank you. And now I know you've mentioned your loneliness experiment and other things. I know you've got another great mass public experiment thing coming up, so we'll save time to mention that at the end. But let's turn to the audience now. Who'd like to ask a question or make an observation? So there's a lady here. There's microphones coming from the back, so if you could just wait for that and ask your question.
Hi. You've talked quite a lot about the effect on productivity, effectively. But what about mental health?
Yes, so there is good evidence that resting is good for people's mental health. There hasn't been nearly as much research done on it as there has on, say, sleep and the benefits of sleep for mental health, because I think rest is something that's been neglected. And so some of the research that has of wakeful rest has been neglected. And so some of the research that, in a way, what we have is the research that we did, where we did find that levels of well-being were lower in those who did get, this optimum amount of rest, not too much rest, but not too little rest. And we found that people, obviously this was cross-sectional, so you can't tell which came first. People, if they had difficulties with their mental health, were also less likely to get as much rest. Now, that may be that their mental health issues were making it difficult for them to rest, and maybe then they felt even more guilty and found it even more difficult to, or just felt to rest less. Or is it the case that not being able to get enough rest was damaging their mental health? And so in a way, most of the research we have to rely on is the research on burnout. And the research on burnout will show it that it's when people have often, particularly work-related burnout, is when the job is so stressful and presents them with demands that they can't possibly fulfill. And that's when, and those people, you'll get people getting very, very little rest in that, and it having a big impact on their mental health.
Thank you. Great question. Let's come to this side of the room. There's a gentleman down here on the right, and then we'll come back to this one here. There's a microphone just behind you. Just wait a second. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wondered if there was any research on the role of rest in the process of grieving.
I don't know of any research on that. I think that would be a really interesting area to look at, because I think that whether people can get rest at that time is interesting, and whether people can get rest in different parts of that process and how that helps, I think would be a very beneficial thing to look at. But no, I don't know of any research on that.
Thank you. So this gentleman here, then we'll take this lady down here afterwards. Thank you.
You mentioned specifically the cognitive and physical benefits of rest, but you didn't mention spiritual benefits. And I wonder if in your thinking and research, the elements of spirituality have been reflected, thinking whether you'd acknowledge the Judeo-Christian understanding of the Sabbath rest built into creation, and the long history of spiritual disciplines, and whether your 18,000 respondents, whether that was reflected in that, either in specific terms in relation to faith, or kind of faith-rooted things, even at the level of things like mindfulness.
I think a very interesting question. I think it is really interesting, really striking how many, how different religions and with, completely different roots will often say how important rest is, and different words will be used for what counts as rest, but this idea of setting some time aside has long historical roots, and I think that's interesting that people have obviously known for a long time that this seems to be a good idea to rest in some way. What we did look at was, because people could write down any activity at all that they found restful, and so mindfulness stroke meditation stroke prayer came number 10 in the list. And I thought that was really interesting with the rise of popularity of mindfulness. And of course, some people will say that we know mindfulness isn't a panacea. Some people will find it difficult and say that it's not for them, and will find it frustrating and difficult and very hard work, particularly at the beginning. Others will really love it and really like it and find it more beneficial. I think but I think that there is something that all of us can learn from rest from one of the things about, say, mindfulness or prayer, which is setting aside time when you're not going to do something else. And I think the same thing could be done even if you chose a different restful activity, if mindfulness or meditation is not for you. that discipline in a way of setting aside a time and saying, I'm not doing something. I'm not going to just do anything at this time. I'm going to do something in particular. Could be beneficial.
It's a fascinating question. Do you think that it's harder for us to have that set-aside time, whether it's for spiritual or any other thing, because of how much easier it is to be interrupted? You mentioned the technology earlier on, but obviously the chance for us to have set-aside time and then have it sort of almost ruined or taken away from us seems greater than ever.
I think it's true. People will say how we're living in an attention economy now, and everyone is, vying for our attention, and our phones are certainly vying for our attention. And I think it's so much harder now if you're, on a train journey to just stare out of the window. You've almost got to make an effort to do that rather than to think, oh, well, here's 10 minutes where I could do my emails. And in a way, I think it's very hard to resist your phone and doing that. There are brilliant things about how phones can keep us in touch with each other, but I think it can interrupt rest, and certainly, as we know, can interrupt sleep, and it can interrupt the rest you get just before you go to sleep. And I think one of the most important things to try to do is not to look at your emails at 11:30 at night. There is nothing you can do about any of them, and the only thing it's going to do is to keep you awake if you read something that you don't like or that's annoying. And also a big thing that particularly parents can do is to buy their kids an alarm clock so that they're not using the clock on their phone, so that so they don't look at the time in the night and then see alerts at the same time. Hugely important to turn your phone off.
Good advice, thank you. So there's a lady with a question down here as well.
Coming back to the effect nature has on achieving a restful state. Is there any research done on particular colours, how particular colours in nature might impact? The reason why as well I ask this is because of experience of cancer patients in isolation, looking at scenes of green forests or the water, but we hadn't actually picked up any, we just know that their experience was better with different colours from what they actually told us, and so their journey of being in isolation was much improved as a result. But was there anything else out there that might identify particular colours?
So some research. So the question was about what colours people might find restful, and research that had been done with patients on that, in case you couldn't hear at the back. And I think that so there has been some research suggesting that green and blue might be more restful, but there has been those studies tend to be quite small and, again, not brilliant. And the better studies are the ones that have been done instead on views of nature, and how views of nature, even on a big screen or a poster, do seem to be more restful than other sorts of views, even nice views. Even a nice view of a city, say, that most people will find the nature one more restful.
Thank you. Other questions? So there's a lady here. Let's come here next. And then back to this lady with the green sleeve in the middle over here. Thank you. So there was one here first. This one here first. Thank you.
Just a very quick one, really, about television. Where does that fit in?
Very good question. Television came at number 9, and I thought that was really interesting. And I think that TV often gets a bit of a bad rap. And we associate it. We'll talk about couch potatoes and rotting your brain and things like that. But when I then looked at this in real detail and looked at the research, if people watch lots of TV, like 5 hours or more TV, that is associated with lower levels of well-being and higher levels of depression. Now, that might partly be because people with depression may not be able to go out and do other stuff, and watching TV may be the thing that they can do with their time. So it's not necessarily causing it, but what's really interesting is if you look at the low numbers, like if people watch 1 hour of TV a day or maybe 2 hours of TV a day, it seems to have a beneficial impact on them rather than not. And I think one of the things that is really relaxing, because for many people this is their go-to, watching TV is their go-to evening activity. And one of the things that I think is really positive about it, particularly if people are doing it with someone else, is that we've heard how people want some time on their own. But watching TV, it's sort of a bit like being on your own if you watch TV with someone else, because you're not required to, you sit side by side, you're not required to interact and say things, but research shows that 20% of the time people are talking while they watch TV, but you're sharing an experience together instead. And I think that, in a way, people have always, for centuries, people have sat around the fire telling stories about other humans doing things. And now, some people have called the TV the electronic hearth, that we now have, amazingly realised dramas written by the best scriptwriters in the world and filmed amazingly. They're just stories about other humans, and we love watching stories about other humans. And again, it distracts us and takes us away from our own lives for a bit. And so I think TV can be very relaxing, and if there's not too much of it. And interestingly, a German study, which was actually called The Guilty Couch Potato, which I liked, found that if they assessed people's levels of relaxation before and after they watched TV, and they asked them about how guilty they felt watching TV, the people who watched TV but felt guilty didn't get the relaxing benefits that those who watched TV and didn't feel guilty about it got. So if you're going to watch TV, don't feel guilty.
Give yourself permission. Thank you. And then this question here. Thanks.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was just thinking that, you seem to be someone that has a very busy life and has a lot on, and I wondered if, any of the book came out of a personal journey for you, and whether you've changed anything about your life, having, done all this research, and, what benefits you've got out of.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, I have to admit that I was someone who wasn't very good at resting. And so it was slightly the irony last year was because I was doing loads of work and then writing the book sort of in my spare time. And so last year it was due in, the Christmas before this one, it was due in last Christmas. And I missed the deadline for it. And so because of that, between Christmas and Easter, I then worked every single weekend except one on both days, as well as working all week. So I was working 7 days a week at that moment, except one weekend where my husband insisted we went away so that I couldn't work for a weekend. And I did get the irony that I was reading all this research about why we need to rest and writing about why it's really, really important to rest. Well, I've got to carry on to get it done. So, and gradually, as I was doing the research, I did try really hard to put it in. And lots of friends laughed when I said I was writing a book about rest, and they would say, "Yeah, but you never rest ever." So, and partly, I think it's, if you have a job, if you're lucky enough to have a job you really like, that's really interesting, to sort of complain about there being too much of it feels a bit wrong. But I have changed things from this. So now I don't feel guilty when I go out in my garden. I do not feel guilty about that anymore, and I do actively try to look for ways of resting. And I am now attempting, my New Year's resolution this year was not to work at all at weekends. And I don't always manage that at all, particularly if I go and give a talk about rest at a weekend. But it has changed things for me in that I'm now valuing it more and seeing it as an important thing rather than the thing that you do when you've just done everything else. And the other change I said I've made I was looking at all the research on to-do lists. And I was thinking about how we need to start to accept that and I've tried to do this, that we'll never get through our to-do lists, and that is okay. And that it's possible that one individual day you'll get through your to-do list, but the next day something else will happen. Pipes will burst, people will get ill, things will happen that will interrupt that, and there will always be more things that you've got to do. Even if it's just, light bulbs blow and you've got to buy more light bulbs, all of those things always adding up. And that, in a way, we need to not be ruled by forever trying to get through it. We need to accept, for the whole of life, there will be loads of things that we have to do and need to do, and that we should accept those. I'd say I've stopped worrying about not getting through my to-do list. And the other thing I did actually, which was sort of as a result of this, was to realise that you can't necessarily do everything that you're trying to do. And so one thing I was trying to do was to learn Spanish. And then when it got to and I did do Spanish lessons for a while, and when it got to about the 20th time where I was doing my homework on the tube, on my knees, on the way to the Spanish lesson, thinking, I haven't done my homework. And then I thought, this is completely ridiculous. This is just making me exhausted. And I don't have to learn Spanish. I'd really like to be able to speak Spanish, but it's okay, and I can live with not being able to, and I will accept that. And I think sometimes you need to give up a thing, but people should choose really carefully what they give up, because it could be that you give up the one restful thing that's helping you do everything else. So I don't think doing my homework late on the tube for Spanish wasn't the restful thing, but it could be that something like, I don't know, somebody belongs to a choir or something like that, and then they look at their packed timetable and think, I can't do all these things, I'm going to leave the choir. But it may be that 2 hours choir practice every week is the thing that is truly restful for them and that allows them to cope with everything else. So I think you can give something up, but you should just look really carefully at what it is.
Well, brilliant question, and really, really lots of wisdom in the response. And it makes me think that I'd like us to do one final sort of exercise before we leave this evening. We're about action for happiness here, so it's all fascinating to hear about other people's experiences and ideas, but it only really matters if we put it into practice ourselves. So why don't we just take a restful moment before I let Claudia come back and say about this exciting new project, and we perhaps show our appreciation one more time. But just take a moment just to, if you're into the spiritual meditation, calmness, whatever you want to see, do take a moment just to sort of breathe, and if you'd like to close your eyes, that's fine. But try and bring to mind something that struck you from this evening, something you'd like to do to bring more rest into your life. It might be giving up something that's causing a lot of extra strain. It might be consciously making time for something you really would love to, nourishes you, but you don't give enough time to. It might be just giving permission for either you or a loved one or a colleague to spend more time on something. Trying to bring to mind a specific thing that you'd like to do more of or less of to get more rest in your life, today, this week, this month, over the coming weeks and months. And try and, again, with action setting, it's really helpful not just to think of the thing, but think, when will I do this? How will I remember to do this? Will I write it down? Will I tell someone? Try and really build it into your plan as you leave here this evening. And maybe on the way out, you could turn to a friend or someone else and just share what's on your mind. But let's leave with some concrete actions to get a bit more of this amazing rest that Claudia's been telling us about. So I'll just leave a few seconds of silence just so you can kind of finalize what that might be. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and Claudia, I know you're working on an exciting new sort of interactive project. You did one on rest,
so
first of all, then you did loneliness. What's next?
So the next one, which you may have, those of you who are Radio 4 listeners may have heard the incessant trails for, is called the touch test. And this time, this is with psychologists at Goldsmiths, University of London. And we're really interested in the sort of the place of touch in modern society. And this partly came out of the loneliness, with some people saying that they had, they couldn't remember the last time they touched somebody touched them. And we want to look at the place of touch in modern society. Do people, how people think it's appropriate to greet each other? Do they want to hug, shake hands? What sort of things materials people like and hate touching? What they think about the place of touch these days. Is technology making it harder for people to have social touch that they might like to? And again, it's an online survey. There's in two parts. If you just do the first part, it only takes 15 minutes. If you do the second part as well, then that's sort of another 15, 20 minutes. And something like 26,000 people have taken part, I think it was, today when I had a look. But it's open for another few weeks, and it is at touchtest.org. Or if you just Google BBC Touch Test, you would find it. But anyway, do take part if you would like to, because I'd really love, I'd love to know what you think. All completely anonymous as well, obviously.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'd like to make one final announcement before we wrap up this evening, but please do join me in giving a massive thank you to Claudia for being here this evening. Thank you.